On the 30th of January 1649, Charles I's head was severed from his body. This anointed king was killed in the full light of day with the backing of Parliament.
This brutal act of regicide comes after 7 years of war that divides towns, friends, and even families.
There is nothing civil about civil war. They have seen so much suffering and death and destruction. They've just had enough.
I'm historian Lisa Hilton, and over 3 episodes I'll trace, day by day, hour by hour, the 5 weeks that led to one of the most seismic moments in our constitutional history, the trial and death of Charles I, a king anointed by God.
No king in England had ever been put on trial for any charge, let alone treason. It was unprecedented.
How did the nation effect this radical step, the reverberations of which are still felt, even to this day?
What they did do changed English law and politics forever.
Hidden within these weeks are the chance events, secret manipulations, and revolutionary actions which led to this ultimate decision.
How did a country kill its king?
It's Christmas Day in the year of our Lord 1648. King Charles I is spending Christmas imprisoned in Windsor Castle. He has lost the Civil War after being captured 18 months earlier by his enemies in Parliament. Charles eats alone, reading the Christmas service from his Book of Common Prayer. His family are in exile, his beloved wife is in Paris, his eldest children are scattered across Europe, the youngest are in parliamentarian custody in England. There's no family Christmas for Charles this year.
And here in Windsor, Charles isn't the only one having a quiet Christmas. The Puritans are in power, and they've done their best to ban what they consider to be a pagan festival. There are laws making the exchanging of gifts, the wearing of fine clothes, feasting and dancing punishable with a hefty 5-shilling fine. It's not exactly festive.
So in London, Christmas Day 1648 is like any other working day. Markets are open, working men and women go about their business, and in Parliament there's no recess.
And today they're urgently debating the future of the country. That all depends on what to do with the king. In theory, the king and Parliament should work together, but the events of the past 7 years have put an end to that. MPs now speak openly of Charles as a man of blood, and they demand that he be made to answer for the horrible violence of the Civil War.
Amongst the MPs sitting that day is Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell comes from a relatively humble background. He's been an MP since 1628, but his early life and career were unremarkable.
Cromwell's not someone who stands on ceremony. He's not impressed by any of that. He famously dresses very shabbily, he has ill-fitting clothes, his hair could do with a comb. He's once seen with blood specks on his collar, he's cut himself shaving. And this is sort of part of his shtick, really. He famously once said that he would rather have a plain, russet-coated captain who knows what he fights for and loves what he knows than that which you call a gentleman and is nothing else.
Cromwell had some sort of nervous breakdown in his 20s, which he later referred to as his melancholia, and from that point on was a devout Puritan.
We know that Cromwell had a religious conversion in the late 1630s, which turned him into the kind of Puritan he was. It's always a dialogue between him and God.
But Cromwell is up against a king who is absolutely convinced of his divine right to rule. Charles believes that he's answerable to God, not Parliament. But the reality is that he's a prisoner of Parliament. And for the last 3 years, they've tried to get Charles to agree to limit his power.
Parliament keep negotiating. They keep going back to Charles, saying, you know, come to terms with us, come to terms with us. And these negotiations are going on and on and on.
Cromwell by nature is a negotiator. He wants to have a settlement between the army and Parliament and the king. What he wants is for the king to come to some kind of constitutional settlement, to something that's like a modern constitutional monarchy.
So far, Charles has refused to compromise.
He was not prepared to give up. He was not prepared to deny his God. He would not agree to that, and that was demanded of him.
For him, it's very simple. You know, his will is God's will, and he is accountable to no earthly authority.
As night falls on Christmas Day, in a last-ditch attempt, Cromwell sends one of his parliamentarian supporters, the Earl of Denbigh, to reason with the king.
The story goes that Charles refuses to see Denbigh and turns him away without even hearing the offer from Parliament.
It seems inconceivable that this deadlock is ever going to be broken. The time to negotiate has come to an end. Tomorrow, Cromwell and Parliament will have to think of a new way to resolve this stalemate. Charles wakes up on the 26th of December. Once he would have spent the day celebrating the feast of St. Stephen, and his servants would have enjoyed their Christmas boxes. Instead, today, he follows his usual routine as a prisoner at Windsor.
So Charles in Windsor, it's not great for him. He's used to space, he's used to majesty, he's used to his own servants. Now he's got army guards, and it's quite a strict confinement. You know, he's got a guard on every door. He doesn't have his family, he doesn't have his friends.
So Charles was becoming increasingly confined. When he'd been imprisoned at Carisbrooke Castle, he had at first been allowed to walk around all the grounds. A very physical man, he liked riding, playing bowls, but he'd become increasingly confined. Carisbrooke had even been allowed to see a woman who was reputed to be his mistress, and he sort of wrote her rather racy letters saying that he wanted to meet her in his private closet and give her a good swiving. Anyway, there was definitely no swiving to be had at Windsor that Christmas.
Parliament does allow Charles to have a servant of their choosing, a gentleman of the bedchamber called Thomas Herbert. Herbert later writes an account of his time with the king.
In his memoir, Thomas Herbert describes how Charles spends his days. Mornings are devoted to prayer, and in the afternoons he takes exercise, walking here on the North Terrace at Windsor. According to Herbert, Charles likes this spot best because it has a very delightful view of the River Thames, with many pleasant hills and valleys, villages and fine houses far and near.
Charles has no way of knowing how long this prison life will go on. He doesn't know that by the 26th of December, Parliament has had enough of his refusal to compromise. Now, whispers in Whitehall begin that the king might be put on trial for treason.
Can a king commit treason? Pretty difficult, you know, when you've got the 1351 Treason Act, which makes it a crime punishable by death to compass or imagine the deposing of a king or to fight for his enemies. So the law of treason is really fashioned to protect the king, not put him on trial.
So how, by Christmas 1648, had this shocking proposition come about? 7 years of civil war has left the country devastated. Battles, skirmishes and sieges took place the length and breadth of the country. Nowhere and no one was left untouched.
You know, for the vast majority of the people, they've just had enough, you know? They just want to get on with it. They want to move on with their lives. You know, there is nothing civil about civil war, and they have seen so much suffering and death and destruction. And I just think they just need closure. They need to move on.
And by Christmas 1648, the winners of the war believe that the blame for all this bloodshed lies at the king's feet.
The troops were demanding justice, a great cry of justice on this man of blood. And they had good reason, because the war that the king started back in 1642 had killed 1 in 10 Englishmen, more comparatively than died in the First World War. 1 in 10 Englishmen were lying dead in the muddy fields of Marston Moor and Naseby and so on, and many more were injured and were permanently injured. The towns were full of beggars who were trailing a lost limb from the fight with the king.
I've come to Leicester, a city that suffered horribly under siege by royalist forces, to look at a collection of petitions from local residents.
The characteristic action of the civil wars was not a set-piece battle, it was an attack on a fortified strongpoint. And if an army broke into a town and terms of surrender hadn't been made, then they could unleash a wave of violence, a wave of retributory violence that would have led to murder, robbery, cutting, maiming, and rape.
An appalling list of consequences for someone who's effectively an innocent bystander.
These documents, over 300 years old, are compensation petitions. Their claims for damages trace a litany of human tragedy.
What are we looking at right here?
Well, here's an example of one of those petitions from William Sumner, a tailor in the town of Leicester, to the mayor and alderman of the town, complaining that when the king's forces sacked Leicester in 1645, they'd killed his son, and that his house had been pulled down, and with the fright whereof your petitioner's wife hath been distracted ever since.
It's such a vivid connection reading about William's wife being distracted, and she suddenly becomes a real person. Is that something you've experienced going through these archives?
Well, yes, we've found many similar stories to this one of people overcome by grief.
How many of these petitions are in existence?
We estimate there are about 4,000 petitions of this ilk in the county record offices in England and Wales, plus a huge amount more in the National Archives as well.
Being in the archive gave an immense jolt of empathy, suddenly seeing the casualties of the Civil War not as numbers or statistics, but as real people, people who lost their families, their livelihoods, their homes. Suddenly they become immensely and poignantly human.
And as night draws in on the 26th of December, Cromwell, Parliament and the army are determined that the king must pay for all this destruction. The next day, Charles is confronted with a stark new reality. The Commons pass a law banning all court ceremony at Windsor.
The ceremonies of state stopped. all the official doffing of caps, all the expected courtesies that would be normally afforded to a king were halted, gradually signalling to Charles, if he'd been under any illusion up to that point, that the end was coming and the sense of his kingly authority was ebbing away.
Charles would have seen it as a deliberate insult to him as king. He had lived as a soldier for years. There were times when he'd been on the run, where he had slept on earth floors. So it wasn't as if he was somebody who could sort of only, couldn't stand life if people weren't sort of bowing and scraping all around him. But, he was a king, and kings were treated in a certain way, and to have this stripped away was clearly a threat and an insult.
Charles is left with one small comfort. His dogs can stay. This punitive action is part of the House of Commons' plan to put pressure on the king. By the 27th of December, the House of Commons is effectively in the hands of the new model army, the force that had faced Charles across the battlefield. But how did a military group come to control the House of Commons?
Just a few weeks earlier, on the 6th of December 1648, Colonel Pride and a battalion of soldiers from the new model army arrived at Westminster. Any MPs who still favoured negotiating with the king were blocked from entering Parliament. When the MPs demanded to know by whose power this was done, they were told bluntly, by the power of the sword. It was unequivocally a coup d'etat. The remaining 80 or so MPs became, insultingly, known as the Rump Parliament, the last remnants clinging to a stripped carcass.
And that's it. At a stroke, about 270 peers are shorn from the Commons.
The Rump, and I call it the Rump because this is not Parliament as we understand it. It's not even the House of Commons as we understand it. This is those MPs who are compliant with the wishes of the army, effectively. There's been a military coup.
Oliver Cromwell is a member of the Rump Parliament. Officially, MPs were not supposed to hold military posts, but an exception was made for Cromwell in the light of his career. Cromwell grew up in the market town of Huntingdon and joined the new model army in 1642. Cromwell is second only in the army to the Lord General, Sir Thomas Fairfax, and is a celebrated war hero.
He becomes the most able, the most courageous, the most decisive of the soldiers that are produced during the Civil War, and he comes from almost nothing.
At the Cromwell Museum in his hometown of Huntingdon, there's a fabulous memento of his military career.
Tell me about the sword. Do we know that this did definitively belong to Oliver Cromwell?
He's got his initials on it.
Where?
Just here.
Okay.
It comes down through the family, so we'd be pretty certain it's his. It's a classic cavalry sword, both for stabbing and swiping. It is a sword that a cavalry officer would have worn. It seems overwhelmingly likely that this is the sword with which he led charges into battle. I mean, one of the things we can say about Cromwell is that he never, ever left it to others to lead a charge. He was always willing to show his own courage and his own confidence by leading.
So is it the case that it was Cromwell's military career that really turned him into the leader he became?
Well, I think fairly early on he starts winning battles, and he never stops winning battles. I mean, it's almost impossible to think of anyone who fought on so many battlefields and won every time. Here's a letter that Cromwell wrote on the 6th of June 1645. So by now he's just been appointed as the head of the cavalry of the National Army, and he's about to plan the battle that is to happen at Naseby. And yet he is able to tell two of his loyal men that he'd recruited himself there's a weakness in the defences.
And the fact that he signed the letter with his full signature implies a degree of communication, of intimacy with his men, a degree of respect between them.
And it's a strong, bold signature, isn't it? Look at the way the C is formed. I mean, the big sweeping C. His signature on it, a handwritten note written under pressure before one of the greatest battles in English history. It's a wonderful example of this, strong, purposeful, determined handwriting of a man confident that he was on the winning side.
Cromwell's military prowess gave him huge influence, and by the 27th of December 1648, he's moved a long way from his humble roots in Huntingdon. He's moved his family to a house in Drury Lane, but he spends most of his time closer to the centre of power, Whitehall.
Cromwell is now occupying a house known as the Cockpit within Whitehall Palace. However, his critics note that he's gone even further. Not only is he living in the palace, he's actually sleeping in one of the king's magnificent beds.
Cromwell's military brilliance has got him this far, but as yet on the political battlefield, he's made no progress against the king. But all that is about to change. This morning, the Rump Parliament are sitting. What was once just a rumour has become one step closer to a reality. Cromwell is introducing a new course of action to break the stalemate. A committee has drafted an act, what at the time is called an ordinance, that the king be put on public trial and charged with treason.
To accuse a king of treason is seriously problematic on quite a few levels. Just on a basic level, how can you have Rex v. Rex? How can a king be charged with treason? And in treason trials, you're tried by your peers. A king has no peers.
When the ordinance is read, there's uproar. So shocking is the very idea that Henry Elsing, the clerk of the court, leaves the house in protest. For any ordinance to pass into law, it has to go through the parliamentary process of the day.
It would be initiated in the Commons, it would be read a number of times, it would then be sent up to the House of Lords, who, if the House of Lords confirmed it, would then pass into, it would pass into law.
But to pass this ordinance is an even greater challenge than usual, as what is being proposed has never been considered before.
In the past, monarchs have been deposed, they've been forced to abdicate, they've been killed. But what has never happened before is no king in England had ever been put on trial for any charge, let alone treason. By even suggesting having a treason trial, the only punishment for which is death, is in itself treasonable.
What makes Cromwell embark on this mortally dangerous path? There's a clue in the powerful speech he delivers to the House.
If any man whatsoever should carry on the design of deposing the king and disinheriting his posterity, or if yet any man had any such thing, he should be the greatest traitor and rebel in the world. But, since the providence of God hath cast this upon us, I cannot but submit to providence. It sounds like a riddle, but basically what he's saying is that since God has put them, the parliamentarians, in this position by allowing them to win the war, then he has no choice but to submit to God's will and try the king.
Providential thinking is very simply this idea that God's hand is in everything. So whether it's something small like, I don't know, toothache or a cannon backfiring, or who wins a war, or even, whether or not you should put a king on trial for his life. People are looking for God's hand in this. Everything is part of God's greater design.
What this means is there's a tremendous anxiety about Puritanism. One is always looking for God's providence. And, of course, the most obvious sign of God's providence is victory on the battlefield. If one wins, then God must want you to win, and you are thankful for that. But again and again, Cromwell refers to this idea that they are merely God's instruments.
It's really the key to him, I think. He's always looking for God's approval or God's direction in everything he does.
The problem is that at Windsor, Charles is also equally convinced that he's God's representative on earth. Charles spends much of his time at worship, following the services in the Book of Common Prayer.
The Book of Common Prayer is really the order of service for the Church in England. It's the liturgy, it's the prayers, it's all the things that the Church was expected to do and the way that services were supposed to be conducted.
Charles is defying a Puritan law by following this book, as they have banned it.
The Puritans found the Book of Common Prayer very much a Roman Catholic document, or at least something that smacked, as they would consider it, of popery. It wasn't the vision of a much more equality-based service. It was too ceremonial. It was too much like Rome and the Roman Catholic Church. It was too much like Mass, which had been outlawed.
There are 2 books in Trinity College, Cambridge, which embody the difference between these approaches to God, one of which is Charles's personal copy of the Book of Common Prayer.
It is wonderful to think that this is the very book that Charles held in his hands, his Book of Common Prayer. Here on the cover are the royal arms, and inside an inscription, Charles Stuart Rex, a book he took out of his closet, 1648.
The Puritans may have banned the Book of Common Prayer, but they have their own godly instruction manual.
This is the Soldier's Pocket Bible, first printed in 1643 and handed out to all parliamentarian troops. It's almost like a motivational rather than a devotional manual. It's divided into sections. Each section has an instruction for the soldier and then a selection of verses from the Bible to justify it. For example, a soldier must not do wickedly. A soldier must pray before he goes to fight. And my favourite, perhaps the most inspirational, and let soldiers and all of us know that the very nick of time that God hath promised us help is when we see no help in man. So we have 2 sides, 2 books. Charles, with his Book of Common Prayer, unquestionably convinced that his right to rule is divine. And Cromwell and his new model army, marching into battle with this little Bible against their hearts, convinced that they too are following divine will.
On the 28th of December, the problem for Charles is that God seems to have shown where his favour lies. He has lost the war and is a prisoner. Within the mindset of the times, God has shown his displeasure. This evening in the Commons, the proposal to try the king does survive its first reading. It's a solution which could ultimately demand the king's life. Parliament is one step closer to ending the impasse. Word of the potential trial of the king is spreading out from London. Abingdon in Oxfordshire is a hotbed of Puritan groups and home to a commoner who now steps into the political limelight. A 26-year-old woman, the self-proclaimed prophet Elizabeth Poole, has had a vision, and she's arriving to share it with the General Council of Officers.
Who was Elizabeth Poole?
Well, nobody. Poole was a woman who had at one time lived in Abingdon, where we are now, as part of a gathered church. This was a church that took place in the kind of room we're sitting in now.
So it was a very informal church.
Exactly. There was no leader. Instead, people would perhaps listen to a sermon from a lecturer, and then they would speak as the Spirit moved them. So they believed that every person could be possessed by the Holy Spirit, speak in the power of God.
So the gathered churches were more perhaps egalitarian than a traditional congregation?
Massively more egalitarian, because there wasn't even a vicar. So they really believed that they were overturning the hierarchy of experts in favour of God's chosen spokespeople. And they argued that you didn't have to have a degree from Oxford or Cambridge to speak in the power of the Spirit, that any person could. And that really opened the door to very unconventional people taking the lead in matters of religion. People like Elizabeth Poole.
How did she come into contact with Cromwell and his fellow leaders?
She approached the Army Council because she said she'd had a vision that was relevant to them.
That's quite a confident thing to do.
Yes, it was an extraordinary thing to do, but that was the kind of moment that it was historically. We're seeing a moment where very ordinary people are finding themselves capable of overthrowing hierarchy and saying what they believe God has told them to say.
And what were Elizabeth's words? What did she claim to have seen in her vision?
Well, this is where Elizabeth really played into their hands. She had a wonderfully sustaining vision of the country as a weak, crippled, feeble woman, and the army as a strong, burly young man protecting that weak and feeble woman.
How extremely flattering.
It was indeed. And so, of course, they listened to her really attentively and endorsed her. And Henry Ireton, an army grandee, said, "I see nothing in her but the fruits of the Holy Spirit."
So what happened after Elizabeth had delivered her vision to the council? What effect did it have?
Well, they were massively keen because she told them what they wanted to hear, that they were these strong, masculine figures and that the country needed them to protect it. It was also because they really wanted God to show them some sign that they were doing the right thing.
Elizabeth Poole seems to be confirming everything that Cromwell and his parliamentarian allies want to hear. But still, they hesitate at the enormity of this course of action. If they pass a law which allows them to put the king on trial for treason, they have to accept that the end result could mean the king's death. At the Bodleian Library in Oxford, there's a document that shows the agonised soul-searching that Charles's enemies are going through.
The title of this paper is a deliberation about the execution of justice upon H.R. And the first thing that strikes me about it is how intimate it is. It's not official, it's not formally worded, it's very private. It's as though I'm being allowed to eavesdrop on a conversation that happened 400 years ago. References in the text date it fairly precisely to the Christmas period of 1648. And although we don't know who the author or authors are, it does seem that they were closely connected with the centre of power, with Parliament or with the Council. Effectively, it's a kind of rhetorical laundry list. It starts with the prose, that the execution of H.R. will stand with the justice of our cause. That is killing the king in line with what the parliamentarians fought for. At times, the document is quite accusatory, enumerating the supposed crimes of the king against his people, as here. Would to God it were otherwise, and that he knew what a stream the blood of 300,000 innocents would make. He would have thought something of a humour and of a hurrying revenge were to be quitted in himself, rather than by holding to either seek to make that rivulet a sea. Effectively, what they're saying here is that King Charles ought to want to die for shame at his crime against his own people.
And then the writer's doubts start.
So here we begin with the arguments against the execution of the king. The first of which is the state of the parliamentarian cause. It's not the case that they're all in unity. They're quarrelling amongst themselves, they're divided, no one knows what to do. There are many different interests at stake. And the authors summarise it thus: rocks have grown out of ourselves. It's a sort of horribly physical image of, yes, dispute appearing like cankers on the body politic. At the end of the list of arguments against Charles's execution, we find this: to have no kingly government at all, and then what everlasting inlets will there be left for torrents of mischiefs and machinations? It's a wonderfully theatrical phrase, torrents of mischiefs and machinations. And what they mean is, if you get rid of the king, then what kind of government you might have? Could it be corrupt? Could it be dangerous? Could it be worse than kingship itself? And so, the authors of the deliberation conclude, for these reasons, therefore, my vote is vivat rex. May the king live.
It's all too clear from this 17th century writer's meticulous rehearsal of the arguments about the king's future that at Christmas 1648 there is nothing inevitable about what will come next. As the month of December draws to an end, despite the ban on traditional Yuletide celebrations, some brave souls are determined to have fun. In London, 4 playhouses have reopened and are illegally putting on performances.
This is the site of the Salisbury Court Theatre, the last theatre to be built in London before the Puritans closed them all down in 1642. But even in the febrile atmosphere of London at Christmas 1648, the players at Salisbury Court believed the show should go on. They took the opportunity to improvise a satire on the current political situation, playing with the crown of one of the characters. This newspaper, the Kingdom's Weekly Intelligencer, offers an eyewitness account of what they did. In the way, they oftentimes took the crown from his head who acted the king, and in sport would oftentimes put it on again. The people, not expecting such a pageant, looked and laughed. But sadly for the actors at Salisbury Court, neither the laughter nor the play at a last.
Soldiers stormed the theatre and shut the whole thing down. Resistance is futile. A parliament controlled by the military is hard to defy. Trapped at Windsor, the king also has no power to act against his captors. For Charles, the best hope of salvation will either come from God or his family abroad.
Charles is very much a family man. He loves his family. The kind of aloof public persona is really quite at odds with the warm individual that he was. He adored his wife, Henrietta Maria, and she is in exile in Paris, trying desperately to get the French to help to put pressure on Parliament and the new model army.
Charles's older children, Charles, James and Mary, are in Holland. Mary's married to the Prince of Orange, and they're trying to agitate from the distance. And then there are 2 children in England. There's 13-year-old Elizabeth and there's 8-year-old Henry, and they are both prisoners of Parliament.
The 13-year-old Elizabeth, who has been writing to him, and he has written her a very touching letter in which he says that he's sorry he hasn't been writing to her much, but when he's feeling miserable, he says he doesn't want to write to her and sort of pass on the misery, essentially, and asks her to give her little brother a kiss, the 8-year-old Henry.
As the new month opens, the Rump Parliament is sitting, and once again the subject of debate is the ordinance to try the king. Since its last reading, a committee has been adding details to it.
They're a committee of the House of Commons. They have been delegated the task of drafting effectively what will become largely their charge against the king and trying to give it some sort of statutory basis.
It's a daunting task. The committee faces two huge problems. There are serious doubts amongst the MPs about the very legality of trying the king. And beyond that, there's no court or procedure through which to do it.
They're struggling to find a structure for something completely new. They could have tried to put him in an ordinary court. The Court of King's Bench would be the court in which treason trials would normally have been held. But then, under the common law, then of course they would have to have a jury. And a jury, although they can be handpicked to a certain extent, are much less capable of being controlled. And their deliberations are not controlled. So even if you think you've got hot parliamentary men in the jury, that may not be the way it pans out.
The committee have come up with a solution. They'll create a temporary High Court which will sit for just a month with the sole purpose of trying the king. And instead of a jury, they'll appoint carefully vetted, what they call commissioners, who will act as judge and jury in one. This still doesn't get over the problem of the dubious legal basis for trying a king. How can you have Rex versus Rex?
The law of treason is really fashioned to protect the king, not put him on trial. And it was a real conundrum until a very brilliant lawyer solved it for Cromwell by charging tyranny, which in our modern term is like committing crimes against humanity, killing or civilians, torturing prisoners, that kind of behavior. And of course, fighting, essentially declaring war on the English people, which the king did. So that was the thinking, finally, that broke this conundrum. Yes, a king can commit treason if he makes war, kills his own civilian people.
Oliver Cromwell is amongst the MPs debating that day, and he's been named as a commissioner. He's on the committee that's drafting the ordinance. But it's hard to find any evidence of exactly what he's doing, or more importantly, thinking at this time. There are no letters or documents detailing his thoughts or speeches.
The point is about Cromwell, he's always elusive. There is this very famous phrase that's attached to Cromwell, that he's practiced at not knowing. He's always slightly off stage. He's always someone who manages not to get his hands dirty when a major political operation is taking place.
It's a mistake made by a lot of historians to think somehow that Cromwell is doing everything and is planning the death of the king and the republic. That's not the case. Cromwell, he's in a state of wonderment. He's waiting on God. He's waiting for these divine signs.
Cromwell may well be waiting for a sign, but parliamentary process is rolling on. The majority of MPs in the Commons accept the committee's recommendations. The ordinance has passed another crucial stage, but it's still not law. To do this, it has to go to the Lords. The very next morning, the ordinance to try the king is sent up to the House of Lords. They are faced with the job of scrutinising this radical new legislation and, if they agree, taking it one step closer to making it law.
They asked the advice of the three judges who had been named as those who were to preside over the High Court of Justice, and all three judges said categorically that the whole thing was a legal farce.
The House of Lords at this stage is only really about a dozen peers, not royalists. They're kept away. So we're talking about parliamentarian lords. They're mainly sort of veteran campaigners, people like the Earl of Manchester, who commanded the Eastern Association in the First Civil War.
Despite being parliamentarians, helping to pass a law to actually put the king on trial and possibly to death is a step too far.
There was a good deal of nervousness. The Lord Chancellor had jumped in a carriage to get away. The Lord Chief Justice had gone to the country. People of high position were well aware of the Treason Act and that it was treason to depose a king, and they were extremely nervous. So the Lords were very reluctant to deal with that. They went to water.
The Lords vote against the ordinance and then declare that they're adjourning for a week. I think they hope that by the time they come back, the whole business will just have been dropped.
If the Lord's ploy works, it might halt the wheels of the bureaucratic machine. But if it doesn't, everything is moving towards the king's death. It's hard to know how much of this drama being played out in Westminster is known by Charles, 25 miles away in Windsor.
There is sort of a sense with Charles right now that he's sort of floating above it all, and he doesn't really seem to have comprehended the gravity of the situation. So sometimes, he might even be talking about planting melons in Wimbledon. And previously he was talking about sort of rebuilding of Whitehall. So there's this sense, I think, that he's just sort of biding in his time, and he's sure that God will protect him.
Much of what we know about Charles at this time comes from his servant Thomas Herbert's memoir. He gives little insight into the king's thoughts and feelings, but he does tell one story.
Thomas Herbert was Charles's gentleman of the bedchamber, and he tells in his account of Charles's time of Windsor of one episode where the diamond seal of Charles's timepiece was lost, and Charles instructed one of his servants to look for it, and the servant looked high and low and couldn't find it, and Charles was sort of disturbed and unsettled by this.
For Charles, denuded of the splendour of his kingly court, a loss like this assumed a huge importance.
Thomas Herbert searched everywhere for the King's seal without success. But in the next instalment of this gripping saga, he recalls that a little before His Majesty went to bed, a good charcoal fire being in the chamber and wax lights burning, the King cast his eye to one end of the room and saw something sparkle, and pointing with his finger bade Mr. Herbert to take a candle and see what it was. By good providence it was the diamond, which he took up and found His Majesty's arms in it, and with joy brought it to the King.
It's a sort of odd event to record, but I think it does show how, certainly as a symbol of Charles's kingly authority, the trappings of his ceremony, the splendour, the magnificence of his position gradually being lost, and he was left to kind of try and find the remnants of things like the diamond seal of his timepiece. But actually, of course, time was ticking, and really he knew that perhaps the end was coming, and certainly his kingly authority was ebbing away.
It's 2 days since the Lords blocked the Rump Parliament's attempts to pass a law to put the King on trial for treason. Hiding in their country houses, the Lords are hoping that in London the whole business has just gone away. But Cromwell and the Commons have no intention of letting this happen. Now they do something truly revolutionary.
This amazing document is the original manuscript of the House of Commons Journal, an account of the daily business of the House. It's more than just a record. It's a minute-by-minute live witnessing of the revolutionary events that were taking place here over Christmas 1648. And here we have the 4th of January. And this unassuming little paragraph is what I'm looking for. Resolved, that the Commons of England in Parliament assembled do declare that the people under God are the origin of all just power, and do also declare that the Commons of England in Parliament assembled, being chosen by and representing the people, have the supreme power in this nation. These two little paragraphs contain a revolution. They're saying that the House of Commons is the sovereign power in the country and that they have no need of the support of the Lords or of the King.
In other words, we're going ahead, Britain, or at least England, is now a republic. Although they don't realize that. They don't get what the implications of their actions are on the 4th of January. But the direct implication is that England is ruled directly by Parliament and by the House of Commons.
You know, it feels really kind of technical and you know, picky to us, but it's a kind of constitutional revolution, because what's happening is the Commons is passing an act without any intervention from the Lords, without any intervention from the King. So that in itself, well, let's say it was revolutionary.
And it's sort of circumventing parliamentary process, it's laughing in the face of the rule of law. And as Charles himself says, actually, you know, if power without law can make law, can alter the fundamental laws of the kingdom, then, you know, no subject is safe in his person or his property.
In politics, everything is moving towards putting the king on trial. The country is inching closer to calling the king to account for his role in the bloodshed of the Civil War. But God is never far from politics, and despite the revolution in parliamentary procedure, those in power still want reassurance of divine approval. And in Abingdon, Elizabeth Poole, who a week earlier prophesied that Parliament was the protector of the nation, now has a new vision.
So Elizabeth went back to the council on the 5th of January.
Yes, and that was also when she produced this.
Wow.
Which is a publication of her vision. So she went public with what she was telling them.
She sold her story to the papers?
Pretty much, yeah.
What did she actually say?
Well, this is where I would suggest that what she did was offered a gloss on her vision. Whereas the vision had been interpreted by the Council of State as this immensely ego-salving tale of them as healthy young men.
A flattering endorsement.
Indeed. Poole was evidently dismayed by the way that they interpreted and, in a way, nicked her prophecy as an endorsement to put the king on trial for his life. She said something that really devastated the council's egos. She recast her vision and explained that for her, the king was the husband and Parliament, including the Army Council, were the wife. And therefore, she said, I'm afraid you can't divorce your husband, because that is the case in English law. You never heard, she said, that a wife might put away her husband. And then to make it a bit worse, she went on as follows. For all that pass by and behold her will say this was a strumpet and not a faithful wife that rejoiceth at the fall of her husband. And contrariwise, the faithful wife mourneth in secret for him. So she's now casting Parliament as strumpet-like.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because from being sort of a strong, virile, masculine figure, Elizabeth is then, in terms of the time, reducing them to a feminine role,
Right.
and one which is sexually intemperate, strumpet. I mean,
Yes.
strumpet means tart, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And we think our parliamentary language is violent now.
Yes.
I think you would probably be rebuked by the Speaker if you called Boris Johnson a prostitute.
That's
The
quite
Army...
courageous.
Yeah, exactly, but you can also go with the Army Council not overjoyed to hear this.
What was the reaction of the council to Elizabeth's words? How did they respond to that?
Very unenthusiastic, as you would imagine. They strongly wanted to be able to say, see, God is totally on our side.
The 5th of January is known as Twelfth Night. the night when Christmas celebrations come to a raucous end. It's a night of misrule, when lords become servants and servants lords. The world is turned upside down. Elizabeth Pool's new prophecy could have upturned Parliament's course of action. But for Cromwell, events have now overtaken any doubts. In his providential worldview, the fact that the Commons are now the sole power in Parliament shows where God's favour lies. So for Cromwell on Twelfth Night, everything is, ironically, in order.
But for Charles, this night of misrule is fast becoming a permanent reality.
On the 6th of January, 2 days after the Commons have made themselves the supreme authority in the realm, they pass a law to put the king on trial for treason.
Finally, the stalemate is broken. Parliament have made their move. Now the king will be forced to account publicly for his part in the Civil War.
The Commons choose Colonel Miles Corbett to inform the king. He's known amongst royalists as bull-headed, splay-footed, bacon-faced Corbett.
According to reports, Charles receives the news with his usual calm. Later, he comes to walk here on the terrace, looking sadly towards London. No one, he says, has the right to try him except his God and his conscience. Cromwell has decided otherwise.
During the 12 days of Christmas, what was once almost unthinkable has now become reality. Parliamentary procedure has been overruled and fundamental constitutional change made.
To try a king for treason is such an outrageous, outlandish thing. I mean, this is a man that can cure people just by touching them. You know, there is something Christ-like about him to many people. So to try him is not only radical, but it's almost blasphemous.
A law may have been passed in Westminster, but now the challenge for Cromwell and Parliament is to enact it. It just hasn't ever been done, and nobody really knows how to put a king on trial. Next time, the tension rises in London.
The people of London are in a state of great uncertainty, they're fearful, they're edgy.
Some of Cromwell's allies get cold feet.
We're talking about deal or no deal. It's been called bargaining with menaces.
And Parliament struggles to find enough men willing to look the king in the eye and sentence him to death.
They knew that most of these people would not take part.
It's January 1649. Parliament has voted to put King Charles I on trial for treason. If he's found guilty, he'll be executed. Parliament are demanding that Charles be made to pay for his role in the conflict of the Civil War. But how will the people of England react when the news is made public? And how, exactly, do you put a king on trial?
This confrontation comes after 7 years of civil war that has divided towns, friends, and even families.
There is nothing civil about civil war. They have seen so much suffering and death and destruction. They've just had enough.
I'm historian Lisa Hilton, and over 3 episodes I'm tracing, day by day, hour by hour, the 5 weeks that led to one of the most seismic moments in our constitutional history, the trial and death of King Charles I.
No king in England had ever been put on trial for any charge, let alone treason. It was unprecedented.
How did the nation affect this radical step, the reverberations of which are still felt, even to this day?
What they did do changed English law and politics forever.
Hidden within these weeks are the chance events, secret manipulations, and revolutionary actions which led to this ultimate decision.
How did a country kill its king?
Tuesday, the 9th of January, 1649, dawns cold in the city of London. The people of Cheapside are going about their business. Shopkeepers and merchants are trading wares. Then, to the sound of drum beats, a parliamentary official approaches a gathering crowd. He's accompanied by armed guards. He has a message to deliver to the public, and what he's about to say is incendiary.
This is a copy of the proclamation. It states that Charles Stuart, the King of England, is to be put on trial for treason. A special high court has been established to bring the king to justice. What was, merely days ago, just a wild threat is now a reality. Never before has an English monarch been put in the dock. If Charles is found guilty, the sentence is death. Regicide, the killing of a king, is now a possibility.
For centuries, the idea that kings and queens are anointed by God has been the very basis of monarchy. The English people have accepted and obeyed the king's divine power. And this is the most significant symbol of that relationship.
This is the Great Seal of England, imprinted in wax and attached to the Royal Charter of the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers. It is such a special object to be close to. It's completely intact, and you can really see the refinement and definition of the sculptural relief. It's much more than a functional symbol. It's really an artwork in its own right. It shows Charles I enthroned, a very regal symbol that was designed to impress. This is the principal seal of royal authority, attached to all the most important state documents as a guarantee of royal assent. It's part of a tradition that goes back to before the Norman conquest, a visual statement of the monarch as the ultimate legal authority. Tradition also has it that when a monarch died, the silver moulds used to make such seals would be broken up by the newly enthroned monarch.
On the same day as the proclamation about the king's trial is made, Parliament takes another bold step.
The House of Commons on the 9th of January voted that the Great Seal of England should be destroyed and a new one made, and they start to think over the design of the new one.
This is the Great Seal of the Commonwealth of England, attached to the Charter of the Worshipful Company of Frame Knitters. Only a fragment of the original survives, but in this replica, you can see that it depicts the interior of the House of Commons. Instead of a king enthroned, it shows the Speaker in the chair. The smashing of Charles's seal is therefore a hugely symbolic act. No seal means no power over the people.
We are still a long way from killing a king, but the destruction of his seal is ominous.
Cromwell has decided that Charles is a man of blood and has to be brought to account in some way. That doesn't mean for a moment that he thinks Charles should be executed. Cromwell is a conservative by nature.
Whether or not Cromwell intends Charles to die, England is contemplating a future without a king. There's been no talk of choosing a relative, perhaps his youngest son, to rule in his stead. This is a significant silence.
I think the monarchy is on trial at this point as well. It's not just Charles. And I think the army has convinced itself, or a lot of the army has convinced itself by 1649, that a republic is possible. I think it's definitely something which is there. It's definitely a possibility. And I think a lot of the army has already become convinced about it.
There are some out-and-out Republicans who want to sort of throw a wrecking ball at the monarchy, but there aren't that many. I think most of them, it's about religion. It's about bringing the king to justice, and they see him as this man of blood. You know, they look at the Book of Numbers, and they think that the soil has been defiled by blood, and that only by the blood of he that caused it, i.e. Charles, can they start to be cleansed, can they start to move on? And I think that's mainly the opinion rather than the Republic. They're not looking to destroy the monarchy.
But where do the people, Charles's subjects, stand?
As the proclamation is read out across London, news of the trial spreads throughout the city. It's on record that the crowds are without violence, injury, or affront. No cheers of support, no cries of protest. A strange neutrality prevails.
What is certain is the public are worn down, exhausted and resentful after years of civil war.
A foreign visitor comments that a people who've formerly been friendly and good-humoured are now melancholy, spiteful, as if bewitched.
The day after the order is given to destroy the King's seal, the date of the trial is set for 10 days' time. "135 commissioners have been appointed to this hastily convened High Court. They will be judge and jury. They're summoned to meet at the Painted Chamber in Westminster Palace to make preparations for the trial.
Commissioners are both judges and jury. It's a combination of both roles. They decide on fact and law. So they decide on all aspects of the case and all aspects of the trial. They are needed for legitimacy. They are needed to emphasize that this isn't the decision of a single individual, nor a single judge, not a single politician, but a collection of military men, a collection of legal men, a collection of people. It's a people's decision.
I've come to the National Archives to see a document which takes us behind the scenes during this unique moment in British history. The first and only time a king is put on trial. I'm just captivated by this document. Here, in pen and ink, are the minutes of the Commissioners' meetings in the Painted Chamber.
It opens with a copy of the Act of Parliament that's just been passed to try the King, in which Charles is accused of having a wicked design totally to subvert the ancient and fundamental laws and liberties of this nation, and in their place to introduce an arbitrary and tyrannical government. The Act is followed by a list of court commissioners who attend the meetings in the Painted Chamber. Here's the list of commissioners on the 10th of January, and that's Cromwell's signature first. On the first day, just 54 of 135 appointed commissioners appear. On the second day, just 46 members show up. That's 89 missing commissioners. Support for the trial seems shaky, to say the least.
When Parliament appointed commissioners, it did not ask them first if they wanted to be commissioners, it named them. It named 150 originally, then 135, but made a quorum of 20. That meant they knew that most of these people would not take part. So that's why they had so many, because they knew they had to get some.
Cromwell must convince some of the country's most high-ranking legal minds that the trial is lawful. The doubters insist that neither Parliament nor the army have the authority to try the king. Only God can judge a king. Anyone else who does so is committing treason.
The commissioners have a monumental task ahead of them. They must chart completely unnavigated legal waters in order to pull off something that's never been done before, the trial of a monarch who's usually above the law. They must prepare their case wrestling with the legal details in order to present the trial as legitimate and legal. If they fail, it's game over. And with just 10 days to go, the commissioners are working round the clock.
This is new ground for everyone, and there's uncertainty even at the centre of the action.
I think there are a number of people who are quite uncomfortable with the way things are going. And I think that's partly because there's a sort of deep assumption of monarchy being at the centre of the English constitution, even amongst the kind of diehard parliamentarians. The other thing that is definitely causing consternation is that it's very clear that this is being driven by the army. And that involvement in the civilian government is something which makes people very, very uncomfortable.
These misgivings are shared by Cromwell's colleague, Sir Thomas Fairfax. He's the man at the head of the army.
Sir Thomas Fairfax is a war hero, famed throughout the land as one of the most outstanding commanders of the Civil War. As Lord General of the new model army, he's led Parliament to many victories. He's been instrumental in defeating the Royalist forces and capturing the king. Now, the final battle of the Civil War is being fought out not in the field, but in the chambers and corridors of Whitehall.
Fairfax has overseen Cromwell's rise within the new model army and counts him among his most trusted friends.
And so what was Cromwell's personal relationship with Fairfax like?
To begin with, extremely good. And there are lots of personal letters between them. And Cromwell always does the courtesy of handwriting them. By the middle of the 1640s, he's using secretaries, except when he writes to his family, immediate family, and when he writes to Fairfax, which I think is a sign of respect.
Or intimacy, even.
Even of intimacy.
But as Cromwell's power increases, Fairfax becomes unnerved. We know he attends the first commissioners' meeting, but by January the 11th, he's notable by his absence.
When it comes to the decision to put the king on trial, Fairfax is irresolute. It's not that he's opposed to it, he simply can't bring himself to really go through with it. And he withdraws from the trial. But of course, lots of people that have been Cromwell's close friends and allies through the 1640s are getting cold feet at that point.
If Fairfax himself seems to lack resolution, his wife, Anne, is a force to be reckoned with. She had followed her husband into battle against the Royalists and had even been taken prisoner. She's fearless. At heart, they're both Presbyterians, moderate Puritans. They do desire spiritual reform, but not at the cost of the king's life.
Fairfax's absence is a huge blow for Cromwell. I mean, personally as well as politically, they'd made a really good team. And it's obviously terrible for army morale if the head of the army is not seen to be supporting them.
I don't think Fairfax has quite the providential mindset that Cromwell has, and he's not prepared to go through on the deal or no deal scenario that is ultimately the trial of Charles I. And he has almost nothing to do with it, and he washes his hands of it.
Moderate Puritan MPs expelled from Parliament implore Fairfax to take action to stop the trial.
This is a copy of a letter written to Fairfax by one of the excluded MPs, Ned Harley.
In it, he condemns the army's actions and begs Fairfax to intervene. Their evils for want of your prohibition will become your guilt, he writes. He goes on, a general's words cannot be other than commands. Fairfax is their general after all, so why does he not command the army to stop the trial?
Fairfax has serious clout. You know, if he wanted to, he probably could have stopped this, possibly anyway, but it would have divided the army. And you know, he loves his men. He commands real loyalty with them. They have fought under him, and he doesn't want to undermine them publicly. So, yes, Fairfax probably could have done more. You know, he comes across as quite spineless, a bit of a Pontius Pilate, but I have quite a lot of sympathy for him. I think there's real anguish there.
Despite the absence of Fairfax, trial preparations continue. But when another commissioner voices deep reservations about the legality of a trial, Cromwell snaps. This letter from Elgin and Sidney recalls a furious exchange with Cromwell. Although a staunch Republican, Sidney is vehemently opposed to the trial. He tells Cromwell that the trial is not legal, firstly, because the king could be tried by no court, and secondly, that no man could be tried by that court. Cromwell is outraged. He responds with much heat, but I tell you, we shall cut off his head with the crown upon it.
In hindsight, it's tempting to see great portent in Cromwell's outburst. After all, we know how this ends. But at the time, nobody knew if this was a revelation of policy or just a flash of temper. Perhaps not even Cromwell.
Cromwell is a born negotiator, both in his military and his political career. And the trial of the king is a further negotiation as to what the king becomes. It's been called bargaining with menaces.
I think that Cromwell would rather that Charles submitted to the court. It would have made life a great deal easier. That was definitely the preferred option. But Cromwell was prepared to cut off Charles's head if he did not submit to the court.
With 9 days until the trial, Parliament is divided. The king's fate hangs in the balance. The remaining commissioners are still battling to pull together their case against the monarch. And if anyone is seriously thinking of freeing Charles, they really should get a move on. With the trial of the king the principal topic of conversation, his subjects are hungry for news. But news can be dangerous. Since the war began, there's been an explosion in press activity, a vast increase in the number of publications flying off the London presses for distribution around the country. And thanks to this continuous flow of news books and pamphlets, ordinary people now have access to information, misinformation, and propaganda from both sides. In the battle between royalists and parliamentarians, the printing press has become a political weapon. In the 1640s and 50s, London bookseller George Thomason bought weekly pamphlets, broadsides, and news books and bound them into 2,000 volumes. Seeing them together at the British Library, you get a sense of this media explosion.
Do you have a sense that as we move towards the period of Charles's trial, that there's a propaganda war being fought in the press?
Absolutely. The propaganda war continues, and we can see it in some of the volumes in front of us.
There would have been people all over the country who were reading this material.
Yes, though literacy is much higher in London than elsewhere. Within London, there's a large community of men who can read, perhaps as many as 60 or 70% of the population of some degree.
Let's start with this one, the moderate.
The moderate is aligned with the levellers.
Procrastination in peril is the mother of ensuing misery, and delays oftentimes bring to pass
that he which should have died kills him which should have lived.
Yeah, he's being very circumlocucious, I think.
It's not a
at this
catchy
point.
headline, is it? It's quite abstruse.
Then it reproduces a letter from Windsor Castle that's quite unsympathetic to the king.
We find his discourse of late very effeminate and talking much of women, which he is sure for the most part to bring in at the end of every subject.
And I think this is part of an attempt to kind of suggest both his frivolousness, but also perhaps his susceptibility to influence by his wife, the Catholic Queen.
Moving on to this one. So this has a much more grand title. So here we have Mercurius Pragmaticus, communicating intelligence from all parts, touching all affairs, designs, humours and conditions throughout the kingdom. That's a fairly broad brief, isn't it?
And as you can see, it kind of begins with a poem.
So that's another contrast. Here we have a poem, and here we have, yes, a very prosaic and prolix introduction. So the royalists had poems.
Yes, but not because the poems represent kind of elite culture or fine art. They're dirty, they're nasty.
So what were these poems like?
Shall I read an example?
Please.
The falsehood, having won the day, now may boldly wear the light. When poor truth must sneak away, slyly skulking in the night. Yet, to have eyes by night, you'll find is better than by day be blind.
It doesn't really pull any punches, does it? I mean, it's accusatory, it's graphic. The idea that truth has been the victim in this process is very clearly stated.
Yes, it's effective, not least because it sort of posits the parliamentarian position as one of blindness.
From political scaremongering to predictions of the end of the world, both sides create a climate of fear. Against a backdrop of conflicting opinions and deep divisions, the public speculates on the king's fate. It's a war of words. Who's winning the hearts and minds of the people?
In London, what will happen is that a newspaper, a piece of propaganda will be printed. Someone will take it to the alehouse and they will read it and share it between loads and loads of people. And it won't just be men reading it. They will discuss it with their wives, and their wives will have an opinion, and their sons will have an opinion, and their daughters will have an opinion.
The king himself is entirely ignorant of these passionate debates. Since he was informed of his trial, he's heard no more. No newspapers, no letters. He doesn't know if he has the public's support. There are 8 days until the start of the trial. Neither Charles nor Cromwell really knows how the people of England will react to the coming spectacle. Today is the 3rd meeting of the High Commission appointed to try the king. Just 34 of 135 named members turn up. A new member's summoned today, a lawyer named John Bradshaw. He's given the thankless task of overseeing the commission. Whether he likes it or not, Bradshaw is appointed Lord President.
If we think about someone like Lord President John Bradshaw,
a completely insignificant and unknown lawyer.
He wasn't perhaps the brightest of the lawyers of the time, but he was a good common lawyer.
I mean, we think about imposter syndrome, for example. Imagine that you are there, a tuppenny halfpenny magistrate from Cheshire, who is very, very reluctant to be put in this position of Lord President. And trying a king, being eyeball to eyeball with the anointed, divine representative of God's will on earth.
The royalist press have a field day, finding a new target in this aggrandised Lord President. The contemporary writer Thomas Fuller dismisses Bradshaw as a man of execrable memory, of whom nothing good is remembered.
I think initially he said he didn't want to do it because of his family. His wife, in particular, was worried about him.
Bradshaw makes an earnest apology for himself that he be excused the position of Lord President. To his dismay, his request is refused. Bradshaw presses his point, again emphasising his reluctance. Again, he's overruled. There's no wriggling out of it.
He was rightly frightened of the Cavaliers, who still had their pistols and their rapiers and were in London, and he was nervous, rightly so.
It's Saturday, the 13th of January, 1649.
There's just 1 week to go before the trial. The commissioners fear their lives are at risk. Royalist factions could mount a terrorist attack, and Parliament is on high alert. The vaults beneath the chambers where the judges sit are searched for explosives and sealed. With the foiled plot of Guy Fawkes a recent memory, this threat is very real.
London is in lockdown. It's a huge security operation. This is the trial of a king. It's never happened before. And the people of London are in a state of great uncertainty. They're fearful, they're edgy. What is going on? Is the king going to be assassinated? Is he going to escape? Is there going to be civil war? Is there going to be invasion? I mean, what is going on? The times are entirely unprecedented, and really anything could happen.
As the trial draws nearer, there are increasing concerns about how the public might react. Parliament fears supporters of the king might rise. The government shuts down London's printing presses in an attempt to silence pro-royalist voices for fear they might stir up the people. There's one piece of royalist propaganda that's particularly dangerous for Parliament. Publication is imminent when parliamentary forces raid a London printing house and destroy it. I've come to Trinity College in Cambridge to get a sense of what the fuss was all about. This is the Wren Library, home for the last 300 years to some of the most precious books in England. But what interests me is one particular volume. This is the little book that Parliament are so scared of. It's the Icon Basilicae, or Royal Portrait, of His Sacred Majesty in his solitudes and sufferings. This claims to be the spiritual autobiography of Charles I, an account of his personal feelings, his religious beliefs, and his justification for the war. Though Charles was not the author, it is accepted that the text was compiled using his own writings. It was made with the king's blessing, and it had been his intention to have it published before the trial. Touching it, the first thing that comes to mind is how tiny it is. It can easily be slipped into a pocket or hidden under a cloak. This book is contraband. It's dangerous. It's the product of a police state. Reading something like this could be very dangerous. Inside, it becomes even more insurrectionary. Hidden in this tiny volume is a frontispiece which shows King Charles I as a Christian martyr. The frontispiece is divided into 3 sections, horizontally and vertically, and each axis expresses the progress of the king towards a potential martyrdom or even sainthood. Here at the bottom, we see his earthly crown. Inside it is written the word vanitas. So this is a vanity, a thing of the world, something which is spiritually worthless. As we move up, we see that the king's right hand is on a crown of thorns, obviously linking him immediately to Christ. Inside the crown of thorns, the word gratia, grace. On the left side of the picture, some palm trees with heavy metal bells depending from them. Crescit sub pondere virtuous. Virtue increases with heaviness, or virtue increases with weight. What it's saying is that through suffering we're redeemed, through suffering we become spiritually better. So these two equally balanced images both suggest Christ. In the middle of the picture sits Charles in his cloak with his hand upon his collar in an attitude of submission. He's looking up at the lighted window. At the top of the picture is his eternal, glorious crown. Beatum et aeternitam, grace and eternity. Although the imagery is dense and complicated, it's also very readable. And what it's setting up is the idea of Charles I as a Protestant saint. The icon is really a masterpiece of royalist propaganda. Here are Charles's words. I will rather choose to wear a crown of thorns with my Saviour than to exchange that of gold which is due me for one of lead, whose embased flexibleness shall be forced to bend and comply to the various and oft-contrary dictates of any fashions. Altogether, the icon presents a portrait of a man whose religious beliefs are unwavering and whose political motives are untainted. This is the king's secret weapon. Were it to have been published before the trial, things could end very differently. There are just 48 hours until the trial. Every day brings Cromwell a fresh set of problems. Government lawyers engaged by the commissioners are still wrestling over the draft of the charges against the king.
To add to Cromwell's woes, the court's Attorney General, William Steele, appointed to conduct the case against the king, sends word that he is very sick and unable to continue his duties. As the all-important chief prosecutor, his was the most important voice in this case. But on this occasion, he seems to have lost it.
So all of a sudden, the commissioners need a new prosecutor.
John Cook is a fascinating person. He's a young-ish, he's in his 40s, barrister, and he's very bright. He's a brilliant, and he's of low birth. His parents were sharecroppers in Leicestershire, and he'd made his way because of his exceptional brightness.
And it's John Cook, a lawyer who's already part of the team, who's the next in line.
Cook has the task of convincing the court and the country that a king is not above the law. He must challenge the divine right and sovereign immunity. He must prove the allegations against Charles with robust arguments and hard evidence. He must build a case which brings down the monarch, and perhaps the monarchy with it. It's a pretty tough brief.
He was rather overwhelmed and inclined to turn it down. He thought, I'm not good enough for this. I'm not respected enough to take on this, the greatest trial in history. And then his religious fervor overtook him. He said, well, maybe God is working through me to show that even the most humble barrister can be the agent of bringing down a tyrant.
The charge sheet has been going back and forth for days as the government searches for the perfect form of words. Cook and Cromwell have less than 48 hours to get it right. It's rejected, revised, and rejected again.
They're flailing around. They're not coming up with the right language for the charge. They haven't solved the problem of how you can prosecute a king.
It had been to and fro before the commissioners. It was too wordy. What they wanted something much more short and snappy. And so Coke, in consultation with some of the commissioners, including Cromwell himself, finally drafted a tighter document.
Charles is to be charged in the name and on behalf of the people. This is a key phrase. Cromwell and the Commissioner's dilemma has always been how to try a king if he is the embodiment of the law.
If you take an understanding of English law and the English legal system as it stood at the time, it is quite hard to justify the trial of a king. But crucially, the safety of the people is the supreme law, and that trumps everything. And there's a really interesting metaphor which gets used, which is, imagine you're on a ship. Now, obviously, if you're on a ship in the 17th century, then the structures of the government of that ship are very, very hierarchical, very, very strict. You can't launch a mutiny against the captain. But what if the captain is driving it into some rocks and he's going to kill everyone? Then, of course, it becomes completely understandable that you have to mutiny against that captain and get rid of them. So that's how this kind of thing could be justified. It's a case of Charles being a danger to the people, so the natural thing that you should do is you should get rid of that danger, otherwise lots more people will die.
Throughout this crisis, there's one government body that's been a thorn in the side of the Commons, the House of Lords.
The Lords have been blocked from the proceedings for voting against the trial, but they try another way. They try to thwart the High Court by preventing the use of the chosen venue, Westminster Hall. The Commons swat the Lords away, declaring that they are the supreme power in England.
Westminster Hall is chosen because it's the centre of public justice in England. It's where the law courts are held. It's where the most high-profile trials have taken place.
Symbolically, doing it there is a way of suggesting continuity with the English law as has gone before. And as much as it is a radical departure, it is kind of unlawful, I think this is a way of trying to kind of paper that over a little bit.
The 19th of January is the eve of the trial. The royal prisoner is moved from Windsor to London. He's heavily guarded for fear his allies will mount an escape attempt.
En route, a man on horseback, one Mr. Proctor, watches the royal coach go by and doffs his hat respectfully. The king acknowledges the greeting, but the guards are furious and set upon poor Mr. Proctor, flinging him into the ditch, horse and all.
The soldiers shed no tears for Charles's predicament. They blame him for all the hardships that have been imposed on them and their families.
Imagine the king arriving back in the capital, the seat of his throne, after an absence of 7 years. It's a far cry from the welcome he would have expected. No fanfare, no flags, no ceremony. For much of his life, Charles has been surrounded by adoring crowds. What does this silent homecoming tell him?
So I think Charles senses the danger that he's in from very, very early on, actually. I think he knows how this ends. He's been worried about people trying to kill him for a long time. I think perhaps the realisation is becoming greater, becoming more real in late 1648. I don't think in early 1649 he thinks that he's going to get out of this.
Charles spends the night before the trial here at St James's Palace under armed guard. This is London's official royal residence, Charles's home, where he lived with Henrietta Maria, where his heir was born. Tomorrow he will face his subjects and his enemies to answer for his crimes against his country.
It's the 20th of January. The day of the trial has come. Charles's barber arrives. But this is a barber provided by Parliament. Charles is nervous that this could be an assassination attempt. As a means of getting rid of a troublesome monarch, it has an obvious appeal.
Assassination would have been so much easier, and it's happened before with kings, Edward II, Richard II, Henry VI.
If you simply assassinate Charles, everyone will know that you've done it. You know, you can't just, pretend that something terrible has accidentally happened.
That's the point. They don't want a grubby murder in a castle. They want this to be out in the open. They want this to be as valid as possible. And it's something the army and Cromwell are proud of. They think this is a glorious thing, that they can bring a tyrant to justice.
They also want to justify it before God as well, and I think they know, or their view is, that God is, God may well have decided against monarchy, but God is definitely not in favour of extrajudicial assassination.
Cook and the commissioners are working up to the wire. With just hours to go, they're still tweaking the charge against the king. Cromwell is nervous. London is on high alert. The Tower of London supplies arms and armour for the 1,000-man guard charged with preventing rebellion or a royal rescue attempt.
This is a display of military might, a clear message to the king and the people that the army is in charge. The commissioners might be running the trial, but it's military muscle which is enforcing it.
This trial isn't taking place in the shadows. Cromwell is adamant that the king be exposed as a man of blood in the eyes of the people. There can be no venue more suited to this than Westminster Hall. Built in 1097, it's one of the oldest buildings in London. Having fought off the Lords' attempt to block its use, the hall is given over to what, for once, it's a gross understatement to call the trial of the century.
Imagine this place. It's loud, busy and volatile, with 5,000 people tensely packed into huge viewing galleries. The court opens with a procession as 20 armed guards march into the hall, followed by messengers, ushers and the court crier. One official carries the sword of state. It's part of the king's regalia and symbolises the power of the monarch to use the might of the state against his enemies. The irony is that it's Parliament using the might of the state against Charles. Even the props of kingship have been turned against him.
Lord President John Bradshaw occupies an elevated position. Behind him sit the commissioners. The eyes of England are on the drama as it unfolds. While the court assembles, the king is on his way to Westminster Hall. He's heavily guarded. There's great tension in the hall. Nobody knows quite what to expect. This could easily go the king's way. The court crier silences the bustling courtroom and asks each commissioner to stand and answer his name. The first on the register is Sir Thomas Fairfax. His name is called. There's silence.
A masked woman shouts out from the crowd, "He hath more wit than to be here." The protester is Lady Fairfax. She does something that her husband doesn't dare to do. She speaks out to oppose the army, the court, and Cromwell. She's an indomitable woman. It's a pity that Charles doesn't have a few more men like her on his side.
And this is massive, you know, that the wife of the head of the army can heckle the court in this manner in front of all these armed guards. You know, it just shows that this is a live event and anything can happen.
The most important trial in history is about to begin. The king takes his seat right here. This trial will determine the power, authority, and legitimacy of the monarchy forever. It's going to be a high court drama like nothing the world has ever seen.
It must have been really disorientating for him. He sits down, he's got the crowd and the guards behind him. He can't see them, he can only feel them and hear them. And in front of him, he's got all these people that he barely recognizes. He's got no legal counsel, it's just him.
John Cook stands. The charge sheet he's holding is the result of days of intense and exhausting work. This is the biggest moment of the young lawyer's life.
And as Cook is starting his opening speech, the king picks up his cane, which has a beautiful silver tip, and bangs the barrister. "Stop," he says, "hold."
And Cook carries on, and then Charles prods him again.
Cook ignored him. He poked him again. Cook ignored him. He then did it more firmly.
Bang comes the cane, the king striking the barrister.
And then the tip, the silver tip of his cane, falls off, and it rolls on the floor. And Charles looks at Cook as if, you know, pick it up.
Cook refuses and continues his opening speech. And in view of thousands of his subjects, the king steps down at the barrister's feet and almost groveling to scrabble around on the floor to find the silver tip of his cane.
The symbolism couldn't have been worse. This is the king bowing before the majesty of the law, not the other way round. And many people saw it as a bad omen.
And this is the moment, this is one of the most important moments in British history, when the people see their king beneath the law. However high ye be, the law is above you.
Once Charles has recovered the cane top and his dignity, the commotion dies down and John Cook continues. The charge sheet takes 10 minutes to read.
So he's blamed for it all. You know, he's blamed for all the death, all the destruction. He is branded a tyrant, traitor, and murderer, and a public and implacable enemy of the Commonwealth. This is the first time Charles will have heard the treason charges in full. He's trying to keep us cool. He's looking at the judges, he's giving them a hard stare. But when he hears those words, tyrant, traitor, murderer, he laughs out loud. And this is a mistake because he is treating the court with scorn.
Lord President Bradshaw instructs the king to answer the charges. The king pauses. Then he plays his card.
Charles responds. First, I must know by what power I am called hither before I will give answer. By what authority? I mean lawful authority. Remember, I am your king, your lawful king. I have trust committed to me by God. Charles refuses to plead. He refuses to acknowledge the legal authority of the court. He states that he is king by divine right, and no power can remove him from his God-given position. The legitimacy of the court hangs in abeyance.
The king was expected to plead guilty or not guilty. He refused to plead. This was the most sensible thing he could possibly do. because he was then throwing back at the tribunal the problem that they always recognized. How can we try a king legally?
It's a good opening gambit. It succeeds in rattling the judges a little bit, but it's going to be hard to sustain. You know, this is only day one, and he is one man against many.
The king's strategy works. Cromwell and Bradshaw are left with no choice but to adjourn. Charles leaves the court triumphant to cries of "God save the king." At the end of the first day, it's the king 1, Parliament 0.
On the first day of his trial, Charles wins the contest completely. The commissioners have to withdraw. They are nonplussed by what happened. He flummoxes them. And they knew that this was going to happen. Cromwell had already anticipated that Charles would deny the authority of the court, and that's precisely what he did. And they still had got a good answer to him, because there wasn't one.
On the other hand, the trial is underway. It looks like a real trial, and they've got the bonus of the king grappling for his silver tip.
That night, the king is drawn into another battle.
Charles spends the night in a private house where he has soldiers guarding him, even in his bedroom, and they're allowed to smoke and drink in his private rooms, so he has no privacy.
The furious king demands that the guards leave him to sleep. After an angry dispute, he gets his way. It's day 2 of the trial.
On day 2, the most important thing is that there is a day 2. In English criminal history, there usually wasn't a day 2. Trials all had to complete within one day.
Westminster Hall is so noisy that Lord President John Bradshaw orders silence on pain of imprisonment. On the first day, the king had refused to plead to John Cook's charges. The court has no right to try him, Charles maintains. This is a problem for Cromwell and the commissioners, but potentially an even bigger one for Charles.
The punishment for refusing to enter a plea is to be pressed to death. It's a medieval punishment, and it's not obsolete. You know, as recently as Elizabeth I's reign, a woman was pressed to death. She was ordered to lie down on a sharp stone, a door was placed on top of her, and 700 or 800 weight was put on top of that until she was crushed to death. Nobody wants to see that happen to the king.
Again, Charles refuses to plead. In justification, he plays a trump card. He aligns himself with the people. Charles explains that if he can be legitimately tried by the self-appointed court outside of conventional jurisdiction, then it could try anyone. No one is safe. If power without law make any laws, I do not know what subject in England can be sure of his life or anything he calls his own. It is not my case alone, but the freedom and liberty of the people. In refusing to recognise this court, then, Charles claims he's acting to protect his people.
He sees around him power, the power of the sword. But does power have the right to make law? No. And if he is to accept the court, then he is basically going to let the people of England live in a country where whoever has the sword makes the laws, and they can make it up as they go along. And as he says, you know, who would have any liberties then?
This is the king's cleverest move. Rather than being portrayed as the person who is suborning the rights and liberties of the people, he portrays himself as the champion of the rights and liberties of the people. He is the defender of the law. He is the defender of the ordinary person who could be oppressed by Parliament. He is not the tyrant. Who's the tyrant? Parliament's the tyrant.
Lord President Bradshaw listens to this. He decides he has heard enough. He spits. How great a friend you have been to the laws and liberties of the people. Let all England and the world judge.
The king is determined not to fight the merits of the charge, which means he has to keep himself to his one legal point, that this is not a lawful court. But inevitably, in his argument with Bradshaw, he steps over the line. And at one point he says, I stand for the liberty of the subject more than you do. That was why I was forced to take to, and he suddenly realizes that he's about to say why he was forced to take to arms. And that, of course, was the case against him, that he started the Civil War. So he came perilously close then, and I think everyone realized that that was a sort of semi-confession, and he drew back. He realized he'd made a mistake.
The king has lost composure today. He seems irritated and argumentative. Perhaps he feels that his strategy isn't working. In this battle of wills and legislation, the prosecution is gaining ground.
Next time, Parliament battles to break the legal stalemate.
Its central message was that no one is above the law.
But the threat of a treason charge still hangs over those who would convict a monarch.
It speaks volumes about what a radical thing this really is.
And as the bitter end draws near, not even Parliament is ready for the consequences.
It is just an extraordinary thing that they rushed this legislation through minutes before the blade was going to chop the king's head off.
As the month of January 1649 draws to a close, the future of England hangs in the balance.
Something momentous is unfolding. For the last 2 days, the King of England has been publicly on trial, accused of being a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and a public and implacable enemy to the Commonwealth of England.
But Charles is refusing to plead. Without a plea, the very legitimacy of the trial hangs by a thread. And so do both Charles's life and the future of the monarchy. This confrontation comes after 7 years of civil war that has divided towns, friends, and even families.
There is nothing civil about civil war. They have seen so much suffering and death and destruction. They've just had enough.
I'm historian Lisa Hilton, and over 3 episodes, I'm tracing day by day, hour by hour, the 5 weeks that led to one of the most seismic moments in our constitutional history: the trial and death of King Charles I.
No king in England had ever been put on trial for any charge, let alone treason. It was unprecedented.
How did the nation effect this radical step, the reverberations of which are still felt, even to this day?
What they did do change English law and politics forever.
Hidden within these weeks are the chance events, secret manipulations, and revolutionary actions that led to this ultimate decision.
How did a country kill its king?
It's the 23rd of January 1649, the third day of Charles I's trial, and so far it has been nothing short of disastrous. In Westminster's Great Hall, Oliver Cromwell and the commissioners once again confront the king.
He is the divinely appointed monarch, and therefore he's absolutely not going to play ball and give them any sense of the authority that they're claiming. Are they really going to kill a king? He's waiting and watching and expecting in this battle of nerve that they will crumble first.
Afraid the trial may collapse if the king won't plead, prosecutor John Cook gives Charles an ultimatum.
Cook tells the king that a refusal to plead will have the weight of a confession. This puts Charles in a tricky position. If he pleads to the charge, he acknowledges the legality of the court. If he remains silent, his guilt will be assumed.
To reiterate Cook's warning, the Chief Judge, John Bradshaw, offers Charles a final chance to admit to the charges or deny them. Sir, you are to give your positive and final answer in plain English, whether you are guilty or not guilty to these treasons laid to your charge.
The king is morally culpable for so much that went wrong in the 17th century. That doesn't mean he was legally responsible for it.
The king is resolute. He will not legitimise proceedings with a plea. He replies, "For the charge I value it not a rush. It is the liberty of the people of England that I stand for. There is no law that allows you to make your king your prisoner."
When the king challenges the legality of the court, he's on a very firm legal basis. It gave him the moral high ground, it gave him the legal high ground. The members of the court didn't know how to respond. Charles said, "Show me the authorities, show me the law." And of course they couldn't show them because it didn't exist.
Bradshaw has been walking a legal tightrope, politely trying to persuade Charles to acknowledge the court. But after 3 days, his patience snaps.
Bradshaw is visibly irritated. He says, "This is the third time you've refused to enter a plea. This is the third time you have impugned the court." And he says, you claim to be looking out for the people, to be protecting their liberties, but actions speak louder than words. And he then goes on to say that you have written your meaning in bloody characters throughout the realm. He can't speak out without accepting the authority of the court.
Once again, the scales tip, this time in Parliament's favour. As night falls on the 23rd of January, Bradshaw, Cook and Cromwell resolve to prove the king is guilty as charged. It's the 4th day of the trial, and the prosecution have a new tactic. To convince the commissioners that Charles is a murderer, a man of blood.
In order to lawfully condemn the king, the judges resolve that they need witness testimony against him, evidence that he is indeed a man of blood. So the High Court decides to call such witnesses.
Calling witnesses is nothing new, but Parliament takes the extraordinary decision to halt the trial and hear 33 testimonies away from open court and away from the king.
the witness statements aren't needed. It's just for the commissioners, just to shore up their own beliefs in what they're doing. They were borrowing from several different legal areas, one of which, that in martial law trials, you take witness statements. It was something that Charles himself had used throughout the war. And so they were trying in some way the king by his own legal standards.
The words of these witnesses were transcribed and are now kept in the National Archives. Where did the prosecution find these witnesses?
As far as we can tell, they're mostly drawn from the parliamentarian army itself.
Do you think it would be reasonable to say that the commissioners said, OK, we're going to charge him with this, go and find me a man in the X regiment who can corroborate it?
Yes. If we take this chap, William Brain, he's very much a committed parliamentarian. William is present when the King's Standard is raised at Nottingham.
So this act, the raising of the Royal Standard, that was crucial to the case that the prosecutors were bringing?
Yes, it's really showing that Charles has personally initiated this conflict and therefore that he is a traitor because he's waged war against his own people, and it's the people who are sovereign, not the king. One of the tantalising witness statements is from Thomas Rawlins. Rawlins says that the Royalist forces at Foy in Cornwall plunder the civilians, even though the king is very close by. He does nothing to stop this. But in fact, we know that the king ordered that those Royalist plunderers should be executed. So he doesn't, ignore what's going on at all. When he's alerted to it, he takes very swift and very severe action against that breach of the laws of war.
It's difficult to feel that these witness statements are anything other than extraordinarily biased. Would you agree?
I think, yes, we can see that some of the witnesses, we can imagine were kind of being pressed to give this evidence. We know from the testimony of one of the witnesses, Samuel Burden, he says he was commanded to give evidence by his officer. So he says he was pretty much coerced. One of the really powerful things about witnesses is that personal experience.
Yes, they're real.
And that you're hearing from real people who have suffered, and those real people need justice.
With each passing day, Charles's control over the trial is waning, and the outcome seems increasingly inevitable. The trial is paused for another day as the court hear more witnesses speak out against the king.
What the witnesses are stating they saw are events that no one doubts happened. He can't deny the fact that he was a part of the war, and therefore he was the author, occasioner of all of these sufferings. He's guilty of it all.
Cromwell's tactic has paid off. After the witnesses have delivered their testimony, 69 out of 135 commissioners at last conclude there is enough evidence to convict the king. Tomorrow, they will sit to decide Charles's fate. It's the 6th day of the trial. Once again, Cromwell and the commissioners gather to consider the case against the king. Once again, the king is absent. A draft of the final charge is read out. Amendments are made and agreed. The final charge concludes that Charles can be convicted of treasonous crimes against the people. The penalty for treason is death.
They defined treason as a breach of the rights of the English people. He had slaughtered people, killed people. He'd used his power to abuse others.
But the commissioners also agree that if the king will finally acknowledge the authority of the court, they'll adjourn and consider what's to be done. Tomorrow will be the king's last chance to comply.
It's the 27th of January and the final day of the trial of Charles I. It's the culmination of not only the trial, but 7 years of civil war and seemingly endless negotiations. In the Great Hall of Westminster, there's a huge crowd waiting to see what fate will befall their king. Some shout justice, others execution.
As Charles takes his seat here, he looks over at John Bradshaw, the Lord President of this High Court of Justice. Bradshaw is robed in red, traditionally worn only for ceremonial occasions or criminal cases.
This is the riskiest moment in English legal history. If sentencing goes wrong, the tables could turn, and charges of treason could be levelled at Charles's accusers instead of at the king.
History is being made, and the setting and ceremony reflect the gravity of the day.
As Bradshaw opens the proceedings, he takes a momentous decision. He declares that Charles's refusal to plead must now be taken as a confession.
Finally, Charles is allowed to speak, and the court scribe records his words. He says that he wishes to delay the ugly sentence I believe will be passed on me, for such hasty sentences once passed are sooner repented of than recalled. He speaks of his desire for the peace of the kingdom.
He says he wants his word to be heard in front of the Lords and the Commons. So once again, he's impugning the validity of the court. While Bradshaw is telling Charles that he can't be heard, there's a commotion behind him, and one of the commissioners, the MP for Arundel, John Downes, stands up and shouts, "Have we hearts of stone? Are we men?" And Cromwell, who's right in front of him, sort of turns around and says, "Are you mad? What ails you?" And basically says, sit down, and Downes says he won't.
The court descends into chaos. Any compassion for the king threatens to destroy these fragile proceedings.
Once again, Bradshaw addresses the king, telling him that he will not be heard by the Lords and Commons, but they'll proceed straight to sentencing. Once again, the king begs to be heard, claiming that he has a new plan for the peace of the kingdom.
He tries to cut a deal, and the only deal they might accept is if he were prepared to abdicate, be sent off in exile to the West Indies or somewhere. In fact, the commissioners who see him now as a vengeful monarch who can't be trusted not to make war on them, decide to plough ahead.
Bradshaw cuts the king short and begins a 40-minute oration in which he will sum up the case against Charles.
Bradshaw wants to prove that Charles is below the law. To do that, he quotes from the Bible, he relies on classical examples like Caligula and Nero, and he claims that Parliament are acting in the same way that the barons did when fighting King John before writing Magna Carta. It was Parliament's duty to step in and defend the English Constitution against any tyrannical king.
But the heart of Bradshaw's argument against the king rests on an event that had taken place just a few hundred metres away in Westminster Abbey in 1626. Since William the Conqueror, all but 2 of the English monarchs have been crowned here, and Charles is no exception.
At the climax of the ceremony, Charles undertook the solemn coronation oath, in which he was asked to promise to keep the peace to God, the Holy Church, the clergy, and the people. "I will," he responded. He was then asked to uphold the laws and rightful customs which the commonalty of this your kingdom have. Again, he promised to do so. Now, in Westminster Hall, Bradshaw is arguing that the king has broken this sacred oath.
The coronation oath was a bond between the king and the people. I think he was probably talking about something broader and more contractual. The king and the people have an agreement with each other. And if one of them breaks the terms of those agreements, by oppressing the other, then the bond's broken.
It's a brilliant move, because this same oath has been at the very heart of Charles's defence. Charles believes that he was born to be king, and he only answers to God. For him, the coronation was the confirmation of this. It's a low blow, but a blinding one.
He is now conscious of justice, the momentum, if you like, of justice. He realizes that his tactic has not worked.
Bradshaw cleverly ends this stage of his oration saying, "Sir, if this bond be once broken, farewell sovereignty." The authority of a ruler is only valid if he protects his subjects. The king has no defence against this.
And then he starts to panic. He's flailing, he's stuttering. I think he suddenly realizes the penny is suddenly dropping, that they're going to do this.
Bradshaw then commands the clerk to read the sentence. Charles Stuart, as a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy to the good people of this nation, shall be put to death by the severing of his head from his body.
They really are going to chop off his head. And he's desperate then to speak, to say his piece, to put forward his argument.
And Charles says, "But I'm the king. Of course I can speak."
But in English law, a condemned man is already dead, and a dead man can't speak.
As the last words ring out across the hall, the commissioners rise to their feet to signify their assent.
69 commissioners stand in agreement of the judgment, showing that they support the judgment. It's not Bradshaw's judgment, it's all of their judgments.
Bradshaw dismisses Charles Stuart and orders the guards to take him away.
England has killed kings before. If one thinks of Richard II, if one thinks of Henry VI, it's done it before. But this has been done by people who are usurping that power. There's never been a kind of judicial sense. It is an enormous leap to make when he's going against God's will.
By giving judgment, their aim and what they did do changed English law and politics forever. They had attempted to shatter and remove the idea of a divine right of kings and to warn every single governor and every ruler that they were always to be held to account by the people.
Charles is carried by sedan chair from Westminster Hall to Whitehall Palace. Troops line the route, but curious crowds jostle to catch a glimpse of their fallen king.
Londoners are shocked, and people are sort of weeping at windows and so forth. Parliament and the new model army are anxious, very anxious about what's going to happen next.
In Whitehall Palace, Charles asks his gentleman of the bedchamber, Thomas Herbert, to remove his much-loved dogs. He wishes to spend whatever time he has left preparing to meet his God.
How long Charles will live is now firmly in the hands of Cromwell and the commissioners. A committee is hastily formed to decide on the place and time of the king's execution.
In the last 24 hours, the Parliament of England has changed the world. Since time immemorial, the king has been the cornerstone of English government, law and justice. Now, he has been sentenced to death. As dawn breaks on the Sabbath, there's a chance for the drama of the day before to sink in.
There was a real sense of incredulity and, of course, also unease. You know, if you kill the king, the world really has been turned upside down.
Under the Puritan regime, Sunday is strictly a day of rest, And as Cromwell and the commissioners are all good Puritans, any plans for the king's execution must be put on hold for the day. But there's no rest for those guarding the king. In the afternoon, they moved Charles from Whitehall to St James's Palace.
These carefully choreographed moves are just trying to mitigate the risk of some kind of escape attempt, just to keep Charles under as strict guard as is possible and away from people who might seek to try and rescue him.
The last known portrait of Charles I, painted by Edward Bower, now hangs here in St James's Palace. Bower probably made studies of the king during his trial and then worked the portrait up afterwards in the studio. He shows the red velvet chair on which the king sat, the hat, which he never removed, and the Order of the Garter hung about his neck. I'm really intrigued by the king's hands. We know that Charles was small and undersized as a child, so it could be that this is simply an accurate rather than a flattering representation. And yet they seem so small, so pale, and so weak. Is there something critical here? Is it suggesting that these are not the hands of a man who's capable of wielding power? I've never seen Charles looking less magnificent or more human. Although the picture was probably commissioned by one of his opponents, it's not hostile. It has a kind of ambiguous tenderness to it. The king's face looks weary, he's aged, his beard is grey, he looks tired, but at the same time there's a kind of serenity, or is it resignation? Some courtiers ask to see Charles, but he sends them away. He does, however, accept a messenger delivering a letter from his son, the Prince of Wales. This letter must have been written before sentence was passed. Charles, Prince of Wales, was in Holland, and even in the best circumstances, news took time to spread so far. The prince recalls that he's had no news of his father beyond rumour and printed news sheets. He ends with the words, "I do pray for your majesty, not only according to my duty, but shall always do all that shall be in my power to deserve the blessing I now humbly beg of your majesty." Perhaps it was better that he wrote those words before he learned the full, dire truth of his father's circumstances. Believing he can still save his father, Prince Charles, the Prince of Wales, initiates the only foreign intervention made on the king's behalf. He persuades 2 Dutch ambassadors to go to London.
Prince Charles is trying to do whatever he can to plead for his father's life, to find a way of freeing his father. But I mean, these are vain efforts. They are really not going to undo the chain of events. Really, the die has been cast.
Unaware of this attempt to save his life, Charles is instead preparing for the next life with the Bishop of London, William Juxon.
And he spent his days praying, making his peace with God. And of course, it was God who he saw that he was ultimately accountable, only to God. A person who really had been marked by insecurity for much of his life. But at this moment of great trial, it seemed that he finds this inner strength. And I think that came through his hours of prayer.
The Sabbath is over, and for Cromwell and the commissioners, there's urgent work to be done. In order to authorise the execution of Charles I, they must sign his death warrant.
A death warrant means that the people that take part in the execution are not in themselves culpable because they are acting lawfully. The person has been condemned to death, and this warrants his execution.
It may be lawful, but the commissioners are rightly fearful of adding their names to the regicide.
Regicide is the Latin term for killing a king. You are doing something that has never been done before. You were killing the Lord's anointed. To do that, you had to be very sure of what you were doing, but most people would be absolutely taken aback by it. It was unprecedented.
In order legally to authorise the execution, Cromwell requires at least 20 names on the death warrant. While he's trying to round up signatures, Parliament agrees to hear the Dutch mission.
First, the Dutch ambassadors come to the House of Lords, where they plead for the King's life. They're told that the Lords can do nothing without the Commons. So next they're received by the Commons, where the MPs fall back on procedure. They assure the ambassadors that they will give proper consideration to the plea, but only after it's been translated. Although the time of the execution has not yet been made public, the rumour is it will happen tomorrow. The Commons are playing for time.
Just along from Whitehall, at St James's Palace, Charles is under heavy guard.
He asks Thomas Herbert to go and fetch a few trinkets that he has stored, a few broken trinkets, a couple of Orders of the Garter, for example. And he says to Thomas Herbert, "Look, this is all the wealth I have left to give my children."
This exquisite portrait miniature shows the middle children of Charles I. James, Duke of York, who was in France in 1649, Princess Elizabeth, and Henry, Duke of Gloucester. It was commissioned while the children were in the care or custody of the Earl of Northumberland, but although he was a parliamentarian, the Earl seems to have grown fond of his royal charges. Since Charles's arrest 2 years ago, he hasn't been allowed to see his 5 surviving children, 3 of whom are living in Europe. Parliament grants him permission to see his 2 youngest, 13-year-old Elizabeth and 8-year-old Henry. Elizabeth left this account of her last meeting with her father. She was known as a serious and scholarly young woman, but she was so beside herself with tears that Charles feared that she'd forget everything that he told her. She promised him that she would write it down. And this is what she recorded. "He commanded us and all the rest of my brothers and sisters to forgive them. He bid me tell my mother that his thoughts had never strayed from her and that his love should be the same to the last." The king went on to try and comfort his daughter, who, like him, was very devout, saying that she shouldn't grieve for him because he went to die a martyr. And then, in what I think is the most heartbreaking moment in Elizabeth's description, he takes Henry, Duke of Gloucester, on his knee. Henry's only 8 years old. He hasn't seen his father for years. And the king explains, "Sweetheart, now they are to cut off thy father's head." He then explained to Henry that he should never, never accept a crown from the army, certainly at least not while his brothers James and Charles were living. And Henry, trying desperately to be brave, assured his father that he would rather be torn in pieces first. A grief-stricken Charles presents his children with his few remaining jewels and trinkets. He kisses them, blesses them, and says goodbye.
They start to leave, and Elizabeth is crying so hard, many of the soldiers and things in the room have overcome, and Charles himself, who's standing by a window at that stage, rushes back to them and embraces them again. It's only then that they leave, and at that point Charles is overcome.
We've seen Charles in this story as the aloof, arrogant monarch. We've seen him as a pious prisoner, a contemptuous sovereign in the dock. But here, for the first time, we see him in the raw, stripped of everything but his love for his children, a desperate father saying farewell to his family, all of them in tears, all of them knowing that they're never going to meet again. Charles's despair will only be compounded by those consenting to his regicide. By evening, Cromwell has far exceeded the minimum number of 20 names on the death warrant. 59 commissioners have signed it.
Even now, some of the commissioners can't quite bring themselves to sign it. So you have 9 who don't sign it. And I think the silence of their non-signatures speaks volumes about what a radical thing this really is.
For Cromwell, signing the death warrant is the only legitimate course of action. He believes it's God's will. Others, aware they may be in mortal peril, later suggest Cromwell has coerced them.
I think we have to be very careful about these. One of them, Richard Inglesby, says that he was physically dragged to the table and Cromwell held his hand and forced him to sign. But this is much later. This is at the time of the Restoration. And he's trying to point the finger of blame at Cromwell. But if you look at his signature, it doesn't look like a signature that's been forced.
The death warrant of King Charles I must be one of the most famous parliamentary manuscripts in England. It's kept in the parliamentary archives, but is considered so precious that it can no longer be taken out of storage to be studied. This, though, is an exact copy.
It's usually displayed in the House of Lords, perhaps as a reminder of what happens when parliamentary sovereignty is challenged. The text itself is fairly brief. It merely outlines that Charles was sentenced upon Saturday last and reiterates the manner of his death, the severing of his head from his body. Here it states unequivocally the place, a street in Whitehall, and the time, between 10 in the morning and 5 in the afternoon. And then here are the signatures. First the Lord President, Bradshaw, and then O. Cromwell.
Each signatory stamps their personal seal on the death warrant, each signing away the King's life.
What strikes me about this document is its bluntness. It's toppling an ancient, mystical institution in just a few curt words. Here they are, in black and white. The King will die.
By signing the death warrant of the King, the signatories knew that should things go pear-shaped and should a monarchical regime come in at some time in the future, what they had done under the Act of 1351 was compass the death of the King. They were clearly guilty of treason.
Once the death warrant has been signed, it is something of a race against the clock to get the King executed. And I think people are scared.
The longer that Charles was around, the more chance he has to escape, the more chance they have for further riots, further rebellions, further uprisings, more civil war, more destruction. They needed him gone.
As night falls, workers are busy erecting a scaffold. Tomorrow, it will be the stage for the final scene in this shocking political theatre. It's the 30th of January, the date set for the King's execution. In the turmoil of the last few days, Parliament have forgotten one crucial piece of legislation.
They've forgotten that if the King dies, then long live the King will be shouted.
It is one of the extraordinary things that it was only on the morning of the execution that Parliament had to pass an act that made it a criminal offence, in fact treason, to promulgate the name of a successor to Charles I. In other words, if anyone were to name Charles II king, they would be a traitor.
As the clock ticks, Parliament rushes to decide whether or not they should be killing both the monarch and the monarchy. Unaware of a possible revolutionary shift towards a republic, Charles resolves to remain regal for the future prosperity of the crown.
He's very wary of being seen to be scared. He knows that it's crucial that he continues this sense of kingly authority right to the end.
On this freezing winter's morning, Charles asks to wear 2 shirts.
He doesn't want to shiver and give the impression that he's frightened. So he layers up and he prepares to stay strong, to stay courageous.
Charles spends the early morning praying with the bishop. He then receives the final sacrament. At 10 a.m. comes the knock on the door. Charles's watch captures that exact moment in time. It's held in the royal collection.
Charles had 2 timepieces, one gold and this silver one. Herbert records in his memoirs that Charles used to wind them every night.
When Charles heard the knock at the door on that fateful morning, he said one more prayer with Bishop Juxon, then turned to him and said, "Come, let us go." Herbert followed them, carrying this watch. As they left the palace, Charles asked him the time. Herbert replied that it was 10 o'clock, and Charles told him to keep the watch in memory of him. Charles is surrounded by guards. Once, his every journey through his capital would have been choreographed with ceremony and comfort in mind. Today, however, he's on foot.
It's about a 10-minute walk between St James's Palace and Whitehall. The morning of the 30th of January is freezing cold, and Charles asked to quicken the slow, solemn pace.
The guards march Charles to Whitehall Palace, where he will wait to be summoned to the scaffold outside Banqueting House. Once the site of opulent masked balls, it will now play host to a very different spectacle.
Banqueting House is chosen for security. It's where the army is headquartered. They're all around Whitehall. It's even got a battery of guns on the roof, so it's perfect.
I think it's because it's a confined space. It limits the size of the crowd. And they're pushed well back. They don't want people hearing whatever it is that Charles has to say.
So who's going to do it? Who is actually going to kill the king? The obvious choice is Richard Brandon, the city executioner.
Undoubtedly, it was Brandon, the normal executioner, because he did a very good job.
Brandon has already beheaded the Earl of Strafford, and he prides himself on his dexterity, eye, and steady hand. The axe, rumoured to have been sharpened by Brandon himself, is held in the Tower of London.
So, for sheer brutality and functionality, this object really can't be beaten. Can you tell me a bit more about it, Bridget?
Yes, it's traditionally the executioner's axe at the Tower of London. It's called a socket axe because it has that tube that runs up the back.
Oh, I can see that here, yeah? And do we have any evidence that an axe like this left the tower at the time of the trial?
We do. There is a warrant saying that the executioner's axe is to be delivered to the sergeant of the court.
So it's possible that this axe could really have been the one that we used to behead Charles I?
Could have been. We don't know exactly.
And would this have been capable of dealing a very clean blow?
Yes, if it's been sharpened, a good headsman should be able to use the axe well, and if he's been practicing, because quite often executioners did not have enough practice in some ways. And certainly part of the myth of Richard Brandon was that he was supposed to have practiced as a child on cats and dogs.
There was a degree of deliberate ambiguity around the identity of the headsman.
Yes.
Why was that?
I suspect it was for his own protection, because people didn't know how everybody was going to react. And they were doing something that nobody had really done before. It was an unprecedented event. And I suspect that sense would say that you don't proclaim that's what you've done when you don't know how popular it's going to be having done it.
As Brandon prepares the axe, the Dutch ambassadors make one last attempt to save the king's life. They visit the head of the army, Sir Thomas Fairfax. Fairfax has been steadfastly against any form of regicide, but now he concedes the king should face the executioner. He tells the ambassadors he would rather protect many lives than one, even if it's the king's. A few hundred yards away, Parliament are not only on the verge of killing the king, they're debating last-minute legislation that could also ensure the death of the monarchy itself.
The House of Commons Journal notes this urgent bill presented on the 30th of January. Here we can see the title under discussion, Concerning the Proclaiming of a King. Emergency legislation is being rushed through the Commons, saying that no one can be proclaimed king without the consent of Parliament. The bill is given its first and second reading, and then the House adjourn at midday for dinner. When they return, the bill is put to the question and assented unto. This must be one of the fastest bits of legislation that's ever passed through Parliament. No time to read the bill, just sign it.
It is just an extraordinary thing that they rushed this legislation through minutes before the blade was going to chop the king's head off. It's often said, well, they've forgotten about it. Had they really forgotten about it? Or was it that they actually hadn't made up their mind until as late as that actually it's not just the monarch who must go, it's the monarchy.
Unaware of these desperate manoeuvres, the king has been waiting at Banqueting House. His intention has been for only the sacrament to pass his lips, but as the agonising hours crawl by, Bishop Juxon persuades him to take a little bread and claret. Just before 2 p.m, Charles begins his final journey to the executioner's block. So Charles walks through here on his way to the scaffold. His eyes must have been drawn to the ceiling, to the masterpiece he himself had commissioned the Flemish artist Rubens to paint. It shows the apotheosis of his father, King James, the king's elevation to divine status. Charles's troubles had largely stemmed from his own belief in his divine kingship, and now he believes that he's on the way to meet his God, his own apotheosis. How does this extravagant, intoxicating image of power seem to him now, this last time? Hubris or vindication?
It must have been quite moving because this is where the Stuart monarchy is most exalted. And even in the gloom, he can look up and he will see that magnificent Rubens painting, the apotheosis of James I. There's this father in the heavens, and yet he, Charles, is very much on the ground and about to place his head on the block.
Charles is guided to the window from where he steps onto the specially built scaffold. As he looks out, he sees a huge crowd held back by troops.
Charles sees the block where he'll soon lay his head.
The block is really low. It's only about 10 inches high. And this troubles him. You know, he's going to have to lie down, but he's told that they can't have a higher block now.
He can see his executioner and the executioner's assistant. In the contemporary images I've seen show them are wearing fishnet. So you can imagine what a macabre sight this must have been, seeing the man who's ever going to kill you and the man who's going to lift up your decapitated head with their features distorted by fishnet.
They were a bit worried that Brandon might quail at the last minute. So his assistant was clearly an army loyalist.
Charles reaches into his pocket for a piece of paper.
Clerks in the crowd take down every word so that the king's last speech can be published for all to read. Charles begins by stating his innocence. He says, "I do not think it needful for me to insist long upon this, for all the world knows that I did not begin a war first with the two Houses of Parliament." After days of refusing to plead, this is his moment to say, "not guilty."
Charles maintains his innocence once again. He says it wasn't him who started the war, it was Parliament. He says he has always been trying to defend the liberties and privileges of the people. And then he says that famous line, "A subject and a sovereign are clean different things."
The king is gracious towards his enemies, declaring that he has forgiven all the world, and even in particular those that have been the chief causes of my death. He hopes that they will take the right way towards the peace of the kingdom. The king's speech is interrupted when one of the executioners accidentally bumps against the axe. "Hurt not the axe that may hurt me," Charles quips. A bit of gallows humour.
He's worried about the axe because he wants to die with dignity. He wants it to be a clean kill. He doesn't want a blunt axe. The execution of his grandmother, Mary, Queen of Scots, had been a fairly messy affair.
Charles turns his thoughts to the people. Truly, I desire their liberty and freedom as much as anybody whosoever. He says that he's only on the scaffold because he tried to protect the people from having all laws changed according to the power of the sword. Therefore, I tell you, I am the martyr of the people.
Charles's speech is a speech of huge courage. These are the words that will pave the way, potentially, for his son to succeed him. These are the words that are going to echo through the years, that are going to be his response to the unprecedented act of killing a king, timed to play to the crowd, and it seems to get their sympathy and their respect, even at this moment of humiliation.
He acts very much like a Christ-like figure, changing the views of those who read it from thinking that he was potentially a tyrant or some kind of murky monarch or difficult figure to being a martyr who died for his principles in an unjust and unfair trial.
Cromwell is absent during this whole performance.
Where's Cromwell? Good question. Where's Cromwell? I mean, once again, he is just out of the frame. He's definitely around, sitting, watching, waiting.
He hands his garter to the Bishop of London, Juxon, with its George. That is the figure of St. George killing the dragon of rebellion with 412 diamonds. So they're sort of sparkling, you can imagine, in the kind of winter light. He wants the bishop to give the garter to his son, Prince Charles, because he will now have to carry on the war. But he just says to the bishop, as he hands it over, he just says, "Remember."
Charles confers with the executioner and says that he will pray briefly and then sign for him to strike. Bishop Juxon gives the final blessing, to which Charles Stuart, King of England, utters, "I go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown, where no disturbance can be, no disturbance in the world."
There's a macabre moment right at the end when Charles is lying down and the executioner bends down and he's just making sure that the hair's out of the way. And Charles says, "Wait for the sign, wait for my sign." And the executioner says that he will, and he gets up, and Charles composes himself, and then he stretches out his hands. And then the axe falls.
So the axe has fallen. Charles's head is raised with the usual words, "Behold the head of a traitor."
A 17-year-old boy is among the watching crowds. Later, he will write that he would never forget that day, nor the sound that was drawn from the people as long as he lived. Such a groan as I never heard, and do desire never to hear again.
Some people were certainly stunned. It was a very shocking moment. Others, however, reacted differently. The soldiers on the scaffold were already thinking about the money they could make. They were poking at the scaffold, trying to dig up splinters of wood covered in blood so they could sell them as relics or mementos. They were cutting bits of his hair, chopping bits of his hair, so that they could sell that as well.
It's not just the soldiers who are keen to grab a grisly relic.
There's a surge, and a lot of people run forward. They try to dip their hankies in his blood. This is, the stuff of martyrs and saints. Relics are seen to have sort of supernatural properties, a sort of holy radioactivity. They're seen to sort of cure the sick, The lame can walk, the blind can see. And there is one story that a wild lion in the zoo at the Tower of London is tamed by the sight of a blood-dipped piece of material from the covering over Charles's dead body.
Some of Charles I's relics are now part of the Portland collection in Derbyshire. So these are hugely potent objects. Tell me some more about them.
The first one is the earring that would have been worn by Charles and was actually taken from the king's head after he'd been decapitated.
Oh.
Yeah, pretty gruesome.
It's quite a beautiful thing, but it's extraordinarily macabre.
After its removal, it was given to the king's daughter and made its way to the king's granddaughter, Mary II.
One hopes they gave it a wash first. And this?
So this is a silver communion cup. He reportedly had his last communion using this cup.
They also have the quality of saintly relics.
Yeah, so you think the idea of having something that once belonged to a venerated figure, whoever they are and whenever they lived, I mean, we see it today, is something that has got a universal appeal.
Charles and his relics may have been gaining popularity after his death, but for the moment at least there seems little chance of a royalist return. The New Republic orders Charles's head to be sewn back on his body and his corpse put on public display. Stark proof of the death of both monarch and monarchy.
Indeed, when Cromwell looked over the body of the king, he said, cruel necessity. And by cruel necessity, what he meant was, this is God's will. There was no alternative.
It's the 8th of February, 1649, and Charles Stuart is laid to rest in St. George's Chapel, Windsor. Once his royal palace, then his prison, it's now his final resting place. There's no fuss, and barely a service. But on the same day in London, books roll off the printing presses. A publication that parliamentarians can no longer suppress. The Icon Basilica, or the Royal Portrait. The icon is likely to have been compiled using a selection of the King's writings. A number of copies are now kept here at the Wren Library in Cambridge. This little book, destroyed at the publishers in the run-up to the King's trial, is finally printed. It has not been passed by the censor, and it bears no publisher's name. Inside, the subtitle explains that it is the portraiture of His Sacred Majesty in his solitudes and sufferings. Immediately, the royalists accept this as Charles's own words.
It depicts Charles very sympathetically as a devout, holy, suffering man, who loves his people. This is the passion of Charles I, and it turns him into a martyr.
And look at this. Icon, 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 icon. In the year following the King's death, the icon was reprinted more than 30 times. The royalists now have a powerful weapon for their cause, a martyred king. For Cromwell and his party, the work is just beginning. They must reunite a war-torn country and rule it as a republic. Charles was killed on the 30th of January, 1649, but the ideal and the threat of kingship still live on. So did Charles have to die in order to save both kingship and the kingdom?
From the parliamentary point of view, yes, I think he probably did have to die for the pacification of the kingdom. From his point of view, he had to die for the preservation of the monarchy.
Was Charles a murderer? He didn't murder anyone in cold blood, but he had blood on his hands. Was he a martyr? Maybe. He is a saint, the only saint of the Anglican Church. He might have been a martyr for the monarchy, but was he a martyr for the liberties and privileges of the people? I think that's a stretch even for Charles.
Charles I's trial and subsequent death moved us from absolute kingship to make way for modern governments. And it set a radical precedent for the judiciary, not only in Britain, but across the globe.
When looking around for precedents for Nuremberg, for prosecuting Saddam Hussein and Milosevic and Pinochet, one goes back to this as the beginning of denying impunity to despots and to rulers who kill their own people.
Charles could have compromised very slightly and saved his own personal monarchy. But in a way, I think he had a martyr's complex. And who's to argue against Charles's providential worldview? Because in the end, it's the monarchy that returned.
As the axe fell, it crushed centuries of royal rule, making way for parliamentary democracy and ensuring that no one is above the law, not even a king.
For the present in England, the death of Charles I means the death of monarchy. The country will be ruled as a republic, left in the hands of the men who claim to represent the people. Will they be able to heal a country ravaged by years of civil wars and destruction? Or will they encounter the same pitfalls as the king they have executed?
If the Republic fails, the 59 men who signed the king's death warrant will be in mortal danger, themselves accused of treason. The stage is set for the revenge of the king.